Hello everyone, this is Chess Teacher Tui. Recently, a friend of mine who would be interested in learning to play chess asked if I might make a series of introductory videos. And so this is the first of these introductory videos, and I would like to help her learn just some of the basics of chess. So this video is going to be a little bit more basic than my videos usually are, but I think it can still be a lot of fun. So what we see on our screen is the initial setup of a chessboard. We see that kings and queens are opposite each other. Some people get that wrong when they set up the board. Kings and queens are always directly opposite from one another. And what we see when we set up the board is the queen is always on their own color. So the black queen is on a black square, the white queen is on a white square. And also, if you don't remember which way to turn the board or which way the board should be turning, remember that the on the right corner, the right bottom corner should always be a light square. So that's how the setup. You have the king, and then the queen should be on the light center squared, and then you have the bishops on either side of the king and queen, the knights farther from the bishops, and then finally the rook. So in this first video, I'm going to discuss just the movement of pawns. Now, pawns, of course, are the most plentiful piece of material that we have. They're considered the most expendable, but they're actually also the most critical. They're the most critical thing in terms of chess understanding and chess development. Uh, the great chess expert Andre Philidor in the 18th century wrote that pawns are the soul of chess, and it's very, very true. So, how do pawns move? Well, it's fairly basic. If I click on the E pawn here, we see that a pawn in its first move can move either one or two squares forward. The first move is the only move where the pawn has the opportunity to move two squares forward. And the most common moves, first moves in chess, are pawn to e4, the king's pawn openings, and pawn to d4, the queen's pawn openings. But also very common is pawn to f4, which is called bird's opening, and pawn to c4, which is called the English opening. In each case of every single one of these openings, whether it be birds or king's pawn or whatever, you notice that they all have something in common. That after the first move, there is pressure, not only one square up, but also diagonal pressure on a central square. So both f4 and d4, they each exercise pressure on the central square e5. Because as we remember, pawns may go one or two squares forward, two squares in the first move, but they attack diagonally. So if white were to open pawn to e4 and black were to respond pawn to d5, this is called the Scandinavian defense, the white pawn can either move forward or capture the d5 pawn, because that's how pawns capture, one space diagonally. There is, however, one exception to this. Pawns can also capture in this very rare scenario. This is a scenario when a white pawn, if it gets to the fifth rank, that's this rank for white, if the pawn gets to the fifth rank and another pawn moves two squares forward so that it's adjacent, so that in this position, either e5 or c5 would qualify for this, the pawn has an interesting move. It can either move forward as normal, but could also capture by going behind the pawn. This is called en passant. The general idea behind this move is that if the c pawn wanted to get to c5, it would need to pass through the square c6 first. So in order to keep the pawn from being able to race past this pawn here, for one move and one move only, white has the opportunity to capture the c5 pawn. However, if white does not do that immediately, let's say plays knight f3, plays knight f6, this move, as you can tell, is no longer available. He can no longer capture the c pawn. So if someone were to do this and were to play this move, if you would want to capture by going behind like that, you would have to do it right away. It does not work if someone plays this move first. So let's say he plays pawn e6, and then he plays knight f3, and then he plays pawn to e5. You cannot capture by going behind. The only time you can do it is when the pawn goes immediately. The logic behind that is if it goes here, well, then you could capture it anyway. So that's en passant. That's one of those situations in chess that does not come about very often. But since I'm making this first video about pawns, I figured it would be a good idea to cover that rule real quick. So this is just my video on pawns, and the rest of the videos on how pieces move I'm not going to make from setting up the board from its initial position. I'm going to use the Lichess study tools. So anyway, this is the first basic video on setting up the pieces and on how pawns move, and I wish you good luck with your chess, and goodbye for now.